Welcome to another episode of How I'm Building This, where we interview startup founders that are in the thick of building their startups. We learn from their mistakes and get practical tips to overcome challenges. Today we have Paul from StreamKap. Hey, Paul, how are you? Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be here. Happy to chat and share a little bit of my experience at StreamKap.
Amazing. Thank you so much. But before we jump into StreamKap, I'd love to learn, who's Paul? Where did you grow up and what got you into sales?
Yeah, so I'm from California. I grew up in Northern California in a very rural area, but then I went to university in California and studied physics and learned that probably wasn't set out to be a scientist. I felt like sort of interacting with people was where I wanted to go. So my first job was as an analyst, which I sort of thought combined some of that analytical science stuff with actually interacting with people as a profession. And that was at a company that was doing sort of natural language processing and sort of AI stuff before it was as good and popular as it is today.
Yep.
And in that company, I ended up taking on a bunch of different roles. Ultimately, got into sales there, and was there through a pivot, and so kind of going from as a part of that pivot, zero revenue for a new product, to sort of double-digit millions, and then went to Bright Edge, where I was in sales for about 10 years and helping scale that business from around 4 million when I joined to over 100 million today. So,
Wow.
so yeah, most of my career was in sales, but started out in sort of analytics, and then got to my co-founder. I went to go work for my co-founder. So he was the founder of Avora,
Yep.
which was a data platform. And we ended up, that was sort of end-to-end data platform. So everything from data ingestion to data warehousing, transformations, dashboards, and AI. We kind of had a rough ride through COVID. We ended up doing a spin out, which was called Gravity Data, which was an ETL tool.
Yep.
And that we sold in 2022. And our experience at Avora and Gravity, we started to see folks doing more streaming, but often spending months getting up to speed with more kind of low-level systems like Apache Kafka, and felt like there's an opportunity to make that easier, and started StreamKap to do that.
That's amazing, Paul. So you said that you worked for your co-founder. How did you decide that he was the right person to start a business with?
Well, yeah, I think that experience I feel very fortunate that we had the opportunity to work together.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of an incremental journey towards starting a business from scratch. So first of all, we at Avora, we kind of went through a pivot shortly after I joined. We had a few big customers go out of business in COVID, and so that really hit our revenue. And so we're trying to figure out what do we do with the business, and we tried to pivot. And so that period, we kind of had the experience of, like, it was a little bit founder light. Like, I think he saw me as a partner in the business, and we kind of found it during that period, like, okay, we can work well together during difficult times and rely on one another, complementary skill sets. And I think, like I said, went through that thinking process, and then we ended up doing a spin out from Avora, which was Gravity. And Ricky, my co-founder, said, "Why don't you go and run that business?" And because I think we built that trust, and that was also a good, from my personal experience, that was like a nice like starting place into founding a company. So there's some aspects of which were like starting a company from scratch, because we had no brand awareness or anything like that. But we had some product already. We had some initial funding as a part of the spin out. So it wasn't like truly starting a company from scratch.
Sure.
So it's kind of like a startup on training wheels, as I like to say. So that worked out well. Where we got to work together on that, where I was actually running the company, but he helped kind of get things going and worked on the product side of things. And again, that was something that we found worked for both of us. So as we kind of wrap things up at Gravity and Avora, we went into StreamKap with a blank slate and a new company.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Wow. So Paul, for StreamKap, of course, that I've seen that you'll have raised $3.3 billion. Just very, very intrigued. How did you decide that these were the investors that you wanted to work with?
Yeah, so we we set out, we hired some folks who we'd worked with previously, and so we kind of knew from the beginning we were gonna need to be a venture backed business, and that was one important decision, right? Like sometimes you can start a business which you can do bootstrapped, and I think I have a lot of respect for that approach, but just the nature of what we were trying to do and how quickly we wanted to move, we first of all made the decision that we wanted to pursue outside investors. And the first, like the pre-seed round that we did was in late 2022, and that was we had some angels involved in that round, folks from Google and Snowflake, who those are sort of obvious ones where you get folks who know the ecosystem that we're building in. But in terms of institutional investors, Hatch led that round. They're a UK fund that really focuses on early stage companies, and we met Scott, who's the founder of Hatch. He's a multi-time founder, and so he's kind of been there before, had a lot of experience with data through e-commerce startups that he started, and that was also something. Ricky, by the way, has a background in e-commerce as well, so I think they particularly had a lot of shared experience, and I think we just found like, okay, he's an investor who really knows what it's like to start a company, and he believed in the mission based on his experience.
Sure.
And then Begin Capital also participated in that round, and just really sharp guys who kind of again saw that vision, and have been great partners in helping grow the business.
That's amazing, Paul. So let's jump into StreamKap. On your website, you say streaming ETL in minutes. What is the pain that you're solving, and for whom?
Yeah, so we really see two kind of profiles of customers. So one is fits the profile which I sort of alluded to earlier, which is they're would have otherwise stood up their own Kafka deployment, which, like I said, typically takes months to do. So it's lower level infrastructure. Ultimately, I mean, one shared element of all of our customers is they have a desire for lower latency data, right? Like they've got often a customer driven requirement that has them looking for, like, how can I get data in front of my customer more quickly, whether that's in e-commerce where you're doing personalization in real time, or in payments or point of sale where there's a direct interaction between your customer and software and hardware that you might be running in that environment, or logistics, again, where it's super important to know what's happening across your operations a lot of times in that case, and then financial financial services as well. So anyway, I won't go through the whole list, but there's the through thread there is a requirement for low latency. And then if we take it a level deeper in terms of the technical side of things, we typically see sort of two kind of scenarios. One is folks have either tried or are currently running a Kafka-based set of data pipelines, but it is either they never got it off the ground because it was too much effort, they didn't have the right specialized skills, or they did and they're just having to invest continual time to keep it operational. So there's a sort of time to value and operational workload concern there. In that context, we're actually built on Kafka. We think it's a great it's a great product, or product, not great the word, it's great software project, I should say. But it's more complex to manage. So what we do is abstract that complexity away, and we allow folks to get data from A to B with no operational overhead. Like they just connect the source and a destination, and the data arrives in sub-second latency, and they don't have to think about any of the operational side of things. And then the other pattern that we see is that folks have not quite made it that far yet. They're still using batch ETL, so that where ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. So it's just a mechanism to get data from databases, often into data warehouses and data lakes. And the batch refers to the sort of frequency. So that means you do it all at once every, on some scheduled cadence, so daily or hourly or something like that. And for these operational and customer facing use cases, that batch processing, often means it's not fast enough, right? So in contrast, StreamKap is streaming, and so every new change that happens, it's streamed right through, like say in sub-second. And so those folks are kind of looking at their batch infrastructure and they're saying like, how can I move this faster? And usually like they have a batch ETL tool, like Fivetran is probably the sort of best known tool in the space. And, that can, they can do 15 minutes as sort of part of their standard plan. But it starts to get very expensive and it's not fast enough. So, folks in that scenario typically kind of plug us into the space that their batch ETL tool was fitting in previously.
Very cool. So how did you go about finding like your first few customers that were willing to pay you?
So it was a combination. So as you do at the startup, you kind of reach out to folks that and one of our early customers was a company that we'd worked with previously at Avora, an e-commerce company, and who are still our customer and have expanded their usage. So that was sort of a friendly, which is good. You can get feedback, but I think you always want to be careful about having too much bias in your initial customer set to people who are who like you and will just try it out. I mean, the nature of our software is not like it's a seat license where somebody will do it just to do it. I mean, we were driving kind of key initiatives in that business and supporting it. So they definitely would have kept using us if it didn't work. But so we did get some real feedback from them. But we also wanted to expand that out. So I've been doing sort of cold outbound to folks, and we also have had some great referrals from customers and partners, and that's kind of built up our current customer base. I should say actually, at the very beginning it was outbound and that sort of friendly introduction, but we've since invested in content and have had pretty good inbound demand gen based on people finding the articles that we've written that are describing solutions to the problems they're trying to solve, and that's another good way to find customers, but that takes a little bit more time.
Of course, that's amazing, Paul. So you get your first few customers. Is there like a feedback process that you develop with them so that it can help you to iterate and of course move faster?
Yeah, so we started in almost exactly 2 years ago, in June of 2022, and we actually had our first customer signed up in July. The very first primary requirement is like, can we get data from A to B, right? Like that's the thing that people require from us most fundamentally. And we were actually able to deliver on that pretty early, so like in July. But that was. And then we had another customer that signed up in October or something like that. And that was kind of in the very early beta. That was very hands-on. Like we actually had to deploy it for them. There was actually no UI initially. So the first big effort of development was build a UI so the customer can actually do it themselves and not just have to interact with us on Slack to get the product there. But during that period, we're working on the UI. We're also working on the stability and the kind of, again, making sure that we could effectively deliver on that base requirement. And then as we got into 2023, we launched the UI and then started refining that. And I think that the main key requirements were fairly clear, I guess, from the beginning in terms of what folks needed. I mean, the product itself is not too different from what we envisioned when we started the company, but there are nuances to that in terms of the product feedback. So yeah, we had a very regular interactions with our customers. I mean, again, like I say, the first 6 months or so, it was less fine-grained. It was more like, okay, they knew they needed a UI. And then there was connectors, right? So for us, there's like the interface that we provide, and there's specific aspects of that. And then there's, in our world, if you don't support the source that a customer wants, then you're not going to be able to support them. So we would add that's mostly been databases initially. So if a customer needed support for, getting data out of MongoDB, we needed to build that. So that's kind of what we spent, again, that first 6 months to a year is really like the underlying infrastructure, getting that where it's reliable and supports the key connectors that people wanted, and then in parallel with that, working on the user interface. And that went live and was, initially live like early in 2023, but really like customer configurable by sort of mid-year. And then we started getting more specific requirements, like, oh, they wanted alerts to tell them if something is wrong. They want to see metrics to see how their pipelines are performing, and that sort of thing, which was kind of what we expected, right? Like it's hard to get really detailed feedback on a UI when you don't have a UI. So that's been kind of a lot of what we've worked on, and we haven't done like a big launch just yet. Although that may have, I think we probably we'll have that in advance of this going live. But I'd say our product for that, our initial use cases was like, general availability level quality as of the beginning of this year, as in like customer could sign up, do everything themselves, and it would just work, and didn't really have to interact with us unless they had, sort of more specific questions. Having said that, like there are nuances to this in the data world, that people ended up, having questions outside of the specific thing that we do. And we have found that, our customers really appreciate the support that we provide as well.
That's amazing, Paul. You mentioned you started with Outbound, then you have a few articles, of course, that have taken some time. So now there are some inbound leads coming in. But let's just stick to just the outbound piece. There's so much talk on like LinkedIn about outbound being completely dead. How's that process for you? Are you essentially creating your list and emailing them and then seeing what obviously comes out of it? Or yeah, I mean, like, is there something that you have done specifically for your outbound efforts that's essentially driving a lot more meetings for you?
I focus mostly on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Email, I haven't made a really concerted effort to do email outbound, but I haven't found as much success, I guess, as I have with LinkedIn. And I think it's a little bit. I mean, it's gotten really hard, to stay above the chaff, and then also to stay out of the spam box. And I'm kind of wary to get into that too much. But I think it can be a good complement. I mean, I think we're starting to add that as we kind of scale out our content. We're adding some email as a component of that. But
Amazing.
yeah, it's mostly been LinkedIn, which I think if folks are, especially at the founder stage, like I think it's a really valuable place because maybe it's not as useful for sales reps. Although I was talking to a sales rep at a partner recently, and he's had good success as well. I think at the end of the day, like people are more willing to talk to founders than they're willing to talk to sales reps. Like that's just the reality of it. And especially at the early stage, you're not necessarily. I mean, you're doing some outreach, but you're actually like the main request that I had for people was legitimately just that I was interested in learning about what they were doing, what their challenges were. And then, I think naturally, like, if you have kind of your funnel's a little different, I guess is what I'm getting at. Like, especially early stage, you're like, okay, I really just want to talk to people who are in the industry, hear what their problems are. And then coming out of the back of that, like some of those people are, you might identify that they actually have a problem that you can potentially solve. And I think the nice thing about that, again, for a founder is like, if you're asking for kind of a feedback and just a general discussion, you sort of select for people who might be interested in they're obviously interested in kind of helping guide like an early stage startup, and by extension, I think they're also potentially the kind of people who might be interested in working with an early stage startup. And so that I think there's a real positive feedback loop, I guess, in the context of a early stage and doing outbound. And it's super important to talk to customers, right? Like that's well trodden ground in terms of advice, but it was pretty integral to what we do. And the other thing is like because my co-founder is technical, but I'm not, right? Like so. as a founder in an early stage startup, there's plenty of stuff to do, but like, most of it is around, for me, is around, customers and how do we get more customers and learn more from prospective customers, that kind of thing. So,
yeah. What you're doing from an inbound perspective?
So, we started with like, it was real clear, like what the problem we were solving. We knew some of those pain points, right? So like, let's talk about the pain points that we're solving for. And, in our world, they're like fairly technical, like fairly specific technical requirements. Like if I'm a data engineer and I want to get data from a Postgres database into Snowflake, and using change data capture, which is like a mechanism to get data out of that source database, then that's probably what I'm going to search for in Google, like that kind of thing, right? So we kind of said, okay, like let's talk about that, and specifically like change data capture and streaming ETL, these kind of things, have some challenges. So there's some good like good material that you can work on there that's again genuinely helpful. Both obviously describing a little bit of what we do, but also just more generally, like what are some best practices and things like that. So that's kind of been the big focus for us, is like just talking about like the technical problems that we solve. So we started fairly low level, pretty narrow and specific around those technical problems we've solved, and kind of iterating through different variations of like the technical landscape that somebody might be working in, right? So broadly, from a StreamKap perspective, the problem we solve is like streaming ETL or change data capture, and we support a bunch of sources and a bunch of destinations. But a given prospective customer, they generally have like some subset of those things that they actually care about, right? Like we support a bunch of different destinations, but a given business usually only has one, right? So I mean, some have multiple, but like that's more like sophisticated orgs usually. So generally they're saying like, I'm gonna need to send data to Snowflake, or send it to BigQuery, or send it to Databricks, and then I've got one or two sources that I care about. And so it's kind of like those pairings and things like that was sort of obviously something we wanted to talk about. And then we also like have written about like how do you make the most out of your Kafka deployment and things like that. So that's kind of another path. And that's been pretty productive for us. And now we're starting to scale that up. And now that we have we've got a pretty good customer base already, and folks who've been successful, and so we're starting to kind of add another layer to that, which is more like the business impact and how our customers are using it in practice, which obviously is helpful. I think one thing that's part of the nature of like what our customers tend, like that is our users are like data engineers, and so they tend to be working on these pipelines that are kind of deeper in the stack, but ultimately they're doing it for a reason. And so helping folks articulate like what's the value of having real-time or near real-time data in terms of business impact is I think really helpful as the leadership teams go to talk about like why they might want to buy StreamKap. So,
yeah, that's amazing. So it's like most of your content mainly focused on bottom of the funnel keywords, or like is it top of the funnel as well?
Mostly bottom of the funnel. I mean,
Okay.
like this is a point where I think the way we look at the world, our world is like, today we want to identify and find customers who've already decided that getting data faster is important to them, right? And so in that context, there's specific keywords that streaming and things like that we're focused on, and like I say, like their infrastructure is what it is, right? So like typically, as in like their source databases and their destinations are usually something they've already decided on, and in the context of faster data, sometimes somewhat less so the destinations, but generally like that architecture is there, and like their preferences, like they want to make as few changes as possible. And that's really one of the things we enable, is like people can get faster data without making dramatic changes to their infrastructure. But the key thing is like they need to care about latency, right? I mean, there's some justification for using us even in the absence of that, but like we have a much higher incremental value for folks who care about latency. And so that's kind of our like we've optimized around that. But one thing that's kind of like short to midterm, let's say, I think there's a lot of companies that care about that. And then sort of longer term, one thing that we believe is like, a lot of, I talked about batch processing today. Most of, data teams are doing batch processing. And for sort of traditional BI type use cases where it's like an internal dashboard or something like that, there isn't really a requirement for real time. Or if people say real time, what they mean is like, every 15 minutes, which is actually fine for batch. But one thing that we think will happen is that when real time is as easy and is cost competitive with batch, then there's kind of no reason not to do it. And I would argue actually that in the discrete part of the process that we own, it actually already is easier and it's definitely cheaper. But there's more to the whole stack that would need to change before everything is real time. And so, we haven't invested, in other words, we haven't invested a lot in like just trying to convince people to move towards faster data,
Sure.
which would be one approach from a top of funnel perspective that we maybe at some point in the future, but I think it's probably a few years away, right? I think there's a lot of market out there of people who already know that they have this problem, and I'm trying to keep us focused on not trying to convince businesses to move to that architecture quite yet.
Got it. Okay. Paul, all of us have made a ton of mistakes. What are some of the things that you wish that you hadn't done?
I think you hear this from a lot of founders, and it's like the big challenge I think at an early stage company is focus, right?
Yeah.
I think we had one thing we were fortunate with is, as I mentioned, we basically built a product that we set out to build from the beginning. And one other way to look at that is like, the idea that we had, like there is a market, like we've definitely got, sort of early stages of product market fit. So in that sense, we've been, fortunate that like we haven't had to think about like a major diversion or pivot or anything like that.
Got it.
But even in the context of that, what might seem like a fairly straight path of like, okay, we set out with this destination in mind, and that's still where we're headed. There's still like a lot of choices that you have to make from a product perspective in terms of focus. And so I don't know if I would say this is like, I can explicitly say this was a mistake, but like one of the things that I wonder about, and I have no way to prove one way or the other whether it was the right decision, was like, I mentioned the different connectors, right? And so, we have support for a bunch of sources and a bunch of destinations. And one thing we did fairly early, and maybe too early, was we built support for several different destinations.
Okay.
And we might have been better off like really constraining that and saying like, we're going to get really, really good at like getting data from, one database to like one destination, and that's all we're doing. And we're just going to get great at that. Whereas we did a little bit more of an expansion, and we had, 3 destinations, and we had, 5 sources.
Sure.
And, there's a trade-off there, right? Like on the one hand, like it's very easy in a vacuum to say like the right thing to do is just do that narrow path. But the reality was we also, for very early customers, you have to be a bit opportunistic in the sense of like, you got to find the people who are willing to work with you. And, that meant in our case, like, people had different destinations they needed, different sources. So it was something that like, I wonder, had we just been super focused and said, okay, we're only going to support Snowflake, would that have been better? But, there were costs to that, but also it's hard to know because that also meant that we were able to get our early customer base, which were important for our, particularly for our seed funding, which I didn't actually mention earlier. But you mentioned the 3.3 million. We raised like, 600,000 in 2022, and then we raised another, 2.6 and a bit in 2023. So that was, on the basis of actually having some customer traction and
Understood.
Anyway, look, it's hard to say what was like what would have been the right, but you kind of always wonder like, okay, what would have happened if we took this other path, and like, would that have been better? But I don't know, I'm also happy with where we are. So, mistake, but and maybe that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's the thing that I kind of wonder about like most in terms of our early stages. Like I definitely think that being focused as much as possible is a good idea. Um, but everything, I mean, that's one thing I'd say it's not really immediately related to your question, but one thing that this is probably not super surprising, that is one of my biggest lessons that I learn all the time about being a founder is like, when you run a business, your life is all about trade-offs, right? Like there's no such thing as a free lunch, and everything that you do, has a real cost to it, one way or the other, right? Like, it's time you're spending on one thing versus another, and that kind of thing. And so I guess that does kind of relate back to the focus thing, right? Like being focused is important because, doing one thing means you're not doing another. If that makes sense.
That's absolutely makes sense, Paul. The one thing that's not spoken out loud enough is about managing mental health as a founder. What do you do to keep your mental health in check as you're building StreamKap?
So one thing I would say that's really helpful is having a co-founder. Like I've never been a solo founder, but I can see like my co-founder, he said to me, like when we were thinking about starting StreamKap, say I wouldn't do another startup on my own. He'd been a solo founder a couple times, and he just related how lonely it is. And I can totally appreciate, right? There's so many things along the way that would have been so much harder had I not had a partner who I could, bounce ideas off, and who could share in the stress, and and particularly, and I feel very fortunate to have a founder who has experience founding companies, so that like he could talk me off the ledge of being stressed about things, and oh, that's normal, or maybe it is not, it is a big deal and something we got to really double down on. But again, you've got somebody to work on that together. So I think that's been one critical aspect that has helped a lot. And I say that like, that's like a big thing that like YC, for example, pushes the co-founder thing. The other side of that, I happen to like follow the YC subreddit, and there's a lot of people in there talking about sort of nightmare stories with co-founders. So I think, again, I feel very fortunate that I was able to work with somebody who we had a chance to work together for a long time. We knew that we could trust and rely on one another, which is obviously another critical aspect of having a co-founder, is that certainly there are scenarios where that becomes a worse thing for your business. But anyway, like putting that aside, just my sort of like how I deal with my own life. I've got passions and hobbies outside of work that really help a lot. So I'm a mountain biker and a surfer, and
Amazing.
both of those are like, I think, have a meditative aspect to them, in that you're like, when you're doing it, you're not thinking about anything else. You're just enjoying it, and it's an opportunity to get out in nature and kind of hit the reset button a little bit. So that's kind of my main way to deal with that stuff. And I there's some aspects that I probably could do a better job of, like I work from home, and sort of that ultimately, especially startup, like the work is sort of never ending, so it's very easy to just like keep working, but try to have like a little bit of time, not necessarily every day, but like be able to get outside and get some exercise in.
Amazing, Paul. What advice do you have for like other founders that are thinking through their outbound and their inbound sales motions?
I mean, I think from an outbound perspective, like I think just do it. Like that's maybe not helpful, like in terms of tactics, but like I do think this is true for me too. Like there's been times when I'm like you get caught up with other stuff, and I think it's just like making sure that you allocate the time to do that. Obviously at some point your business gets big enough, and maybe you as an individual founder are not doing it anymore, but certainly in the early days it's super important. And maybe that's one regret I have, is like during those early days there were periods when I got focused on fundraising or things like that, where like I wasn't doing as much outbound, and I think it's like, I probably should have like just been a bit more structured in my day, and like said, okay, this is, I mean, I know this based on my sales background, right? Like prospecting is just something you kind of always need to make time for. And I think it is something that gets compressed down if just for sales reps, right? They have got like later stage deals, they focus on that, and then they close all their deals, and then they got no pipeline, right? So it's just something you kind of need to have that consistency. Is probably the main thing I'd recommend. And then there's obviously more subtle tactics around that. And then from a content perspective, I'd say like, when I used to sell SEO software, and there was like I don't know, I think it's like a Japanese adage or something like that. Like, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. And content takes time, and so I think like starting that early, and by the way, it's like also great way to sort of early in your stage, like help you articulate what it is you're doing, and helps you be thoughtful about like your customer problems. It's also something you can kind of pull from customer conversations, right? So like I think starting that early as well and being consistent about it. I would say actually we have not been up until fairly recently, we've not been super consistent about having that cadence, and I think that's something that we should have done, is be more consistent in producing content. But having said that, like one thing I think we did well there is started early. And,
sure.
I think, like I say, SEO takes time. There's just a big like leak of Google data about what they do with how SEO works basically over the weekend. And I was talking with a friend, former colleague who's working with us on our content. And he had dug into a bit, and it's stuff that SEO people have been saying for a long time. But one of the things is domain authority, which is something that takes a long time, right? Like, so anyway, all of that's just like a way to reinforce that, starting early on the content is also pretty important. Probably before you have a product, maybe your product's not live yet or whatever, like, just start writing about it anyway. Start writing about the problem you're solving anyway, even if you don't have a product. Which actually, I would briefly expand on that. Like, that's another thing that also ties into, if you're doing it on LinkedIn and sharing that there as well, or on Twitter, whatever like your platform is, even before you start a company, if you kind of start writing about the problem, that can be a way where you kind of get the flywheel going. And anyway, just it helps with outbound as well. So something I'd definitely encourage.
Well, amazing, Paul. So what's next for you and for StreamKap?
Well, we're like I say, I think between when we're recording this and when it will launch, we're doing sort of a rebrand and more formally launching and announcing our like general availability and some customer case studies and formally talking about the fundraising. So I'd be somewhat remiss if I didn't say also, like, on our seed round, we have some great partners at InReach Ventures, which are just experienced folks who built a lot of businesses, and 1013, which is a great kind of network of like founders basically who are contributing into a fund. So they're the ones who co-led our seed round. So anyway, more details of that will be out, I guess, by the time this goes live. So that's kind of like right now we're kind of heads down on that. There's Snowflake Summit next week, and always a great opportunity. A lot of our customers are on Snowflake, so a lot of our meeting up with folks in San Francisco, and as the back half of the year, like we're starting to like I say, focus more on content and scale up our go-to-market efforts. Basically, now that we have a product that we're seeing like customers love it, kind of the clear signal is there, like, okay, we just need to get more customers, because when people get it in front of them, they're happy with it.
That's amazing. Well, Paul, this has been so much fun. Such a pleasure to, of course, learn more about you, learn more about StreamKap. Thank you so much for, of course, giving me some time today. Once again, if there's anything that, of course, that we can do to help, please, of course, let us know. But Paul, really appreciate this. This was great learning. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.